That look, okay? Okay, let's get started. So I'm just going to move this. Okay, so feeding wild birds is a deceptively commonplace activity, yet it is one of the most intimate, private, and potentially profound forms of human interaction with nature. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Yeah, so you just thought watching birds was fun. Well, not really. It really has a deep connection to how we think about life. And I know that because I worked with the project when I was at Brock University with a colleague who was in the healthcare profession. And what we did was we had an arrangement with a long care nursing facility. Uh, and what she did initially was test the residents for their wellness. And then we had funding so I bought bird feeders and lots of bird seed. And I bought two feeders. Actually, I bought an expensive one, and then Tim helped me make a do it yourself kit one. And we put them up in front of the big windows that they had at that facility. And in fact, there were four big windows where they could observe the birds because it was a two-story building. It was and I have to say it was and then I talked to the residents about what birds they might see, and the reaction was overwhelming. We couldn't believe how much the residents loved the bird feeders. They fought for window space, um, and they would complain because their wheelchairs couldn't get in so they could see the feeders. The staff loved it because they knew their patients were happier, and that, if they were having a bad day, and they mentioned this often, the staff would help them get to the window so they could watch the birds, and it helped them get through the bad days. Families loved it because it was something else they could do with their loved ones. And a lot of these people, miss their families quite a bit, especially their grandchildren. And so this was something else that would occupy their minds and calm them. But the biggest surprise was actually the locked in area where um, the staff would take people who were having issues and take them to the window and put them in front of the window so they could see the feeder, and it calmed them right down. So they ended up using it as a calming technique. So unfortunately, we couldn't get that many patients that had the cognitive ability to fill out the wellness form. And in fact, two of our key participants passed away during the 1 year course of this study. So we never did get it published, but the anecdotal information was amazing because I never expected that kind of big response from people, but it just showed to me how this connection with nature is so important to us. And I know I was talking to one person, um, and we had quite a conversation for like 15 minutes. And afterwards, as I was walking out, the staff came up to me and they said, "What were you talking about?" And I said, "Well, she was just telling me about walking in the woods and seeing birds when she was younger. She lived on a farm." And they said, "She hasn't talked for weeks." So, I mean, you know, I think this is something in our busy lives that we forget, that we are so connected to nature. And I think COVID has shown a lot of people how important that is. So let's get back to feeding birds. So, what do they need? Well, they really just need a few things. They need water, they need food, and they need shelter. Well, it's a slippery slope. You may think you get a shepherd's hook and get some cheap seed and put it in a feeder that you found on sale, but no, trust me. As soon as you get into bird feeding, you will start adding on, and sooner or later you will have this arrangement of multi feeders for different kinds of birds, and you'll become obsessed with it. It certainly has been helping me get through these past few cold days. So the easiest form of feeding is ground feeding, or in this case, stump feeding. Um, so basically, you just get some feed and scatter it on the ground and hope that you can get some birds that way, and you probably will. Various parks around Niagara, people just leave seeds out on various structures, and sure enough, the chickadees and some other common birds will come and peck away and eat it. But it's always the surprises that make it worthwhile. So this fall we had a fox sparrow, which is a ground feeder in our yard, and also this Cassari's junco, which is actually just a dark-eyed junco, but it's a subspecies from the west. So, and I think there was kind of a movement of some birds from the west into Niagara, and this is probably evidence of that small movement of birds. Another really easy way to feed birds is window feeders, but they only really attract a few species. And you have to be careful too around windows that the birds aren't colliding with your windows. So you want to have something hanging in your window that breaks the reflection, because what happens is um, the natural area outside is reflected in the window, and the bird thinks that they're going to continue flying in a natural area where when in fact they're going to uh, be abruptly stopped by a plate of glass. You can also buy a lot of products online that they're basically a strip that you put it on your window, and it's just got a lot of little dots, and they serve the same function of breaking up the reflection. So here's our feeders. I really like these platform feeders. I first found out about them when I was looking for feeders at the long-term care facility. And they work so well that Tim actually cobbled together some really interesting setups here. So, and the neat thing is you can hang other feeders off of these. Um, the important thing with the platform feeders, I think, is to have some kind of lid on it, because if you just have the open platform, then the seeds can get wet or get in the snow. And once the seeds get wet, then they could start rotting and build up bacteria and fungus. So, and that, of course, is harmful to the birds. So, what you want to do is keep that kind of moisture off the seed. And a lid also serves another really important function, because um, you can get predators, and certainly accipiters have learned to use feeders as a food source. So this is a sharp-shinned hawk. There's also Cooper's hawk. We had an issue with a Cooper's hawk in our yard earlier on this year. And they just see it as McDonald's, and it's easy to come in and snatch up a few of your birds. And in fact, I think we lost a couple of birds to the Cooper's hawk. If you Now, personally, I don't know, maybe not everybody's like that, but I like to observe what happens when it catches a bird and dispatches it. But other people may not enjoy that kind of scene. In fact, I didn't put that kind of scene in just in case. Um, but if it really is upsetting to you, you just need to take your feeders down until the hawks leave town. And I'll explain later why that isn't a bad thing for the birds. Um, the other thing is you want to kind of have your feeder close to some habitat if you can, so that they can hide. So a brush pile is perfect. Even though the hawks will land on top of the brush pile and try and reach down in to catch a bird, it actually provides them with a lot of protection. So if you can, I know not all yards that's possible, but it's good to have some scrubby stuff or some evergreens or something where the birds can hide from predators. And hawks aren't the only predators, so you may get owls at night. This is a screech owl, an eastern screech owl, and they're actually quite common even in urban areas. And you can put up boxes for them to roost or nest in, because they're cavity dwellers. But they're nocturnal, so they probably don't come to your feeder at night. But remember, there's going to be some seed that gets spilled off the feeders onto the ground. And a lot of the ground feeders will actually eat that seed, but so will mice at night. So that's when you get the screech owls coming in sometimes to try and find a mouse for dinner, which is pretty exciting. And but you often don't even know they're there. Sometimes you can hear them this time of year courting and singing, but mostly you don't even know that they're there. I have to talk about cats because they are the biggest predator of birds, particularly in the spring and summer when there's baby birds, and birds will bring their babes to a feeder. The thing with the baby birds is they don't fly very well. And in fact, when they leave the nest, they often end up on the ground. And so it's obvious how susceptible those baby birds are to a predator, especially like a cat. And in fact, the mortality of baby birds is 90%. And a lot of that is due to cats, whether they're feral or domestic, being able to easily get a bird kill in your yard or even under your feeder. So if you can leave your cats indoors, that's great, or at least indoors when you know that there's birds fledging young in your yard. Platform feeders are great for photography too. And I just wanted to use this example of a rose-breasted grosbeak. This was a young female. This is November, and she still looks like a fledgling. She's got, some of her pin feathers look like they're still on her head. And yeah, she's very young, and she obviously fledged quite late in the year. And hopefully, because she found her feeder, she was able to do a migration south because she cannot survive in the winter. And hopefully our feeder was able to feed her until she could make that migratory flight and come back and find this handsome young man on the right side and breed with him and have babies. So I call these birds, they're really called rose-breasted grosbeaks, but I call them Mother's Day bird because when they return from the tropics, they often end up in our area on Mother's Day. And what they're doing is they've had a long migratory flight and they often come to feeders and fuel up before they head to woodlands where they will nest. But what was I going to say? Sorry, brain fart. So most people don't even know that they nest in this area, but they do. But they only see them on Mother's Day. So often, and you will, if you people know you're into watching birds, you'll get this call or email. I had a beautiful bird at my feeder that I've never seen before, and I'll say rose-breasted grosbeak, and they'll say, "How did you know?" And it's just because they're so spectacular, especially the males in the spring. And it's true, most people who don't bird watch don't know what this bird is. And another good reason to feed the birds in the spring. And I was going to talk about feeding. When do you feed? Well, most of us, I think, feed all year round because you're going to get different birds and you're helping different birds at different times of the year. So let's get into some other kinds of feeders. This is called a hopper feeder, and the birds at this hopper feeder are pine siskins. This year we've got quite a few of them in the area because they rely on cone trees that have cones up north to survive the winter. But there was a cone crop failure this winter, which means a lot of the birds that depend on those cones and the seeds inside for survival in winter came further south to find some cone trees. And so this is a winter when that's happening. So this would be a winter when you might see unusual birds at your feeder that you don't normally get. And pine siskin is one of them. You can see how streaky it is. It's got a bit of yellow on its wing feathers, and it's got a tiny, tiny little beak. So it likes small little seeds like Niger. But let's get back to the hopper feeders. They're weight activated. So birds like this weigh hardly anything. And so they're able to sit on the perch and get the seeds. But if something heavier comes along, like a blue jay or a squirrel, it closes. So that has a lot of advantages to not feeding things that you birds that you don't want to feed, and just feeding the small little ones that you really like. So that's how you would choose this feeder. It's versatile, so you can either hang it or put it on a post. And again, it attracts a good variety of birds. And you can see, because it's covered and it closes, that it provides a lot of protection for the seed as well from getting wet. And it's designed especially to keep what I call the miniature pigs away from your feeder, which can be a problem in some yards. The next kind of feeder is called tube or finch feeders. And it depends, you can put a lot of different things into these. But the small birds like Niger seeds, which are very tiny, and and you get some really, really great birds feeding Niger seed, which is a bit more expensive. So that's another thing you have to think about when you're setting up to feed birds, is how much you want to spend on feed, because that's an ongoing cost on top of just buying the feeders. And you can see this one has a dome on top, a plastic colored dome, so you can still see a plastic dome, sorry. So you can still see the birds, but it keeps the seed from getting wet. And these kind of feeders are quite susceptible to getting wet if you just left them out without the dome. So purchasing the dome as well is a really good idea, or finding some kind of innovative dome to put over top of them is great too. Um, it's really good if you can keep these feeders as clean as you can, because if they do get water into them, then it gets kind of moldy and musty down at the bottom of the feeder. And again, that can be harmful to the birds. The really neat thing right now is that birds like American goldfinch will come to these feeders, especially for Niger. And you can watch this time of year as they molt into their breeding plumage. So here you've got a winter American goldfinch, but slowly the males will molt into this beautiful yellow color. And people often call them canaries or wild canaries because they're so bright yellow. So goldfinch, pine siskins, and if you're really lucky, you might get a common redpoll at your feeder. This is another one of those birds that are coming south because of the crop failure. And this is actually a photo from a feeder in Stevensville. So very exciting to get these birds at your feeder. I can tell you that 10 or 15 years ago, it was quite common to get these kind of birds at your feeder, like the pine siskins and the redpolls. But as they decline, it's not such a common thing. So that's kind of unfortunate, and a good reason to protect what little habitat we have left. If you get a bird that you don't know what it is, send me a picture, send it to the club, um, and I'll try and help you identify it, or I may want to come over and have a look at it. And so if you get something unusual like a red pole, let me know. I'd be happy to help you out with that. Okay, but the tube feeders can be used for peanuts, and I have to say, the most exciting feeder to watch at our place is the peanut feeder, because so many really cool birds love it. Um, the white-breasted and the red-breasted nuthatch like it. So this year again, we've got red-breasted nuthatches that have come down from up north. We get multiple woodpeckers at our feeder, including a pair of downy woodpeckers, a pair of hairy woodpeckers, and a pair of red-bellied woodpeckers. And in the summer, we get red-headed woodpeckers, which is really exciting. The starlings also like it too, so got to put up with that, as well as the house sparrows. Um, so how does this work? I mean, it's pretty amazing that they can get those peanuts out of there, and especially for woodpeckers, because they seem to peck at them to get them. And it seems to me like it would be an enormous headache for them to do that, especially when they're pecking at it 20 times per second. So, the motion is quite rapid and it's very firm. You can see that they're gripping with their claws, and they're also propping themselves with their tails to hold themselves steady. They actually have to close their eyes. It doesn't look like his eyes are closed right now, but if they didn't close their eyes, their eyeballs would actually pop out of their head because the force is so great. So what they've done is they've evolved some really important impact absorbing adaptations, including specialized skull bones, neck muscles, beaks, and even their tongue is specially designed for this high impact action. And in fact, they even have less internal fluid surrounding their brain. So think of it as a hard boiled egg instead of a soft boiled egg. So the skull is firmly holding onto the brain as they're pecking. Another really great feeder is suet feeders. And it's really, the birds just love suet. And it's really important for them because it's high energy, same as peanuts. That's why, if I could only have two kinds of, well, that's not true. I won't say that, but it's really important to feed them this high energy food, especially in the winter, because they need that protein to survive. Suet's pretty versatile. You can even make your own. A lot of people have their own secret recipe, depending on which birds they want to attract and what those birds like. Woodpeckers will even use suet in mesh bags. You can put them in the metal cages like this, and there's a lot of stores that sell the regular size holders, which also match the suet that they will sell. So you can make it or buy it. Having a tail prop makes it easier for woodpeckers to get the suet. And in fact, if you put suet out and you get a Carolina wren, they'll thank you for putting suet out. I hope that didn't make you seasick. I was doing it as a handheld. Um, you can hear their tea kettle, sound when they sing. So here's some suet bags, and this is an excellent series of photographs by Ron Goodrich. So you can compare downy and hairy woodpeckers, which can be hard to tell apart in the field and even at your feeder. But what I want you to do is hold up your hand and measure how wide the bird's head is from the base of the bill to the back of the neck. Okay. And then if you move your hand and then use that length to measure the bill, look how long the hairy woodpecker's bill is on the right side compared to the width of the skull, as compared to the downy woodpecker on the, wait a minute, I got that wrong. Look how long the hairy woodpecker's bill is on the right side compared to the downy on the left side. And so using the width of the head is a really good idea. It helps you tell them apart. Even so, there's going to be birds that are kind of middle range. So another way of trying to identify downy and hairy woodpecker is by their tail. Okay. So the bird on the right is a downy because it has black dots. Get it? Downy dots on the outer white tail feathers. Okay. And then if you look at the bird on the left, which is actually hairy, the bill doesn't look long enough, but it is actually hairy, and you don't see any black dots on the outer tail feathers. So that's another way you can identify them, and very helpful if you don't see the front of the bird or the bill. Okay, another great feeder for the summer is nectar feeders, and this is birds and orioles. All you need to use for nectar is water and sugar. That's all the birds need. In the warm weather, you dissolve a quarter cup of sugar in um, a cup of water. In the winter, they need more, so you'd bump it up to a third of a cup of sugar. Um, you don't need to boil the water unless you're going to try and store it for more than 2 days. And definitely don't use anything like honey in it because honey will promote the growth of bacteria and fungus. And again, you don't want that for your birds. And definitely don't use any red food dye. Nectar is transparent. It's not red. The red of the feeder attracts them because they think that they're flowers, but the actual nectar is clear. And red food dye would poison them. So don't use that. And you just need the water and the sugar. That's it. Okay, urgent, urgent update. Welch's grape jelly has been discontinued. Don't tell the Baltimore Orioles because they love it. This is a feeder I have out in my garden where I put grape jelly, but also this summer I used raspberry jelly jam, and they seem to like that just as well. Of course, you get the odd bug in it, and if there's any left over, some critter at night gets it. But the Orioles will just love it, and they can come in close, and you get some great views of them. And they too will thank you, but they have to kind of get ready first. Okay. So, how do you choose your seed? That's really complicated. There's all sorts of mixes that you can buy. Generally, the better quality the seed, that means more protein, the better the birds. Niger seed is not cheap, but goldfinch, pine siskins, house finch love it. Sunflower seeds are good for house finch as well as sometimes you'll get a special visitor like a purple finch, which isn't that common. Um, Cardinals love it, goldfinch love it, grosbeaks love it, juncos, chickadees, nuthatches, and all the regular species. A little bit more expensive, but better for the birds is black oil sunflower seeds. Um, they have higher oil content and higher calories because that's what it's all about. The birds need the energy to survive the winter, particularly, and then during the rest of the year, they need energy for their courtship and breeding and just general living. You don't want to use if you unless you don't mind feeding squirrels and mourning doves and other birds like that. You don't want to get mixes that have especially crushed corn um, because it's not as high in nutrition for the birds And again, it attracts maybe species that you don't want. A hint I just read about and didn't know about is that you might want to put some grit in with your seed on the platform feeders, because birds need some kind of grit. That's why you sometimes see them along the roadside. They're picking up little pieces of grit, stone, or whatever, because they need it for their digestion. And so you can actually buy like budgie gravel, or just some clean sand, and put it in with the seed on the floor of a platform feeder so they can pick up some grit for digestion. Sometimes you get an extra special visitor. And this last winter, a feeder in our area had an orange-crowned warbler stay all winter, which is remarkable. They will try and overwinter, but unless they can find a suitable um, feeder set up, it'll probably be pretty tough if it gets cold. So this person had a lot of suet out. You can see there's just 2 suets feeders there, and that bird pretty much relied on the suet to survive the winter. And a lot of us were really fortunate to go and see this gorgeous bird that is hard to see in migration. It's one of the more difficult warblers to identify in the field. So it was great to just observe this bird for so long, and it actually made it into the spring, which normally they don't. There's been a lot of people studying if this particular species can make it through the winter in one of our winters, instead of going to the tropics. But this bird actually made it into the spring, which was remarkable. But if you really love this bird, the homeowner didn't, but you could actually buy mealworms and put it out for this bird, which he would really appreciate. So you can spend a lot of money on this. Okay, another important thing is storing seeds. So we have the garbage cans that, the metal ones that you can put the lid on, snap the lid on, and then twist. The raccoons haven't figured that out yet. And you can see that the squirrels will do pretty much anything to try and get into a feeder. When I was doing the long-term care project, I had the seeds stored in those heavy duty plastic containers, and squirrels would chew a hole in that. And it was like, I would say at least half an inch thick. And they would chew that plastic trying to get into the seeds. So it's a big game trying to keep critters out of your seed if you store your seed outside. So where do you buy your seed? That's a really good question. And I was lucky that they discussed that quite a bit on Facebook recently. And it seemed like the overwhelming winner was Miner Brothers. So I was glad that Linda had mentioned that before. They have a lot of great selection, so you can choose your seed according to which birds you'd like to feed. They have, for instance, a cardinal mix. And then they have a squirrel free mix. So there's lots of choices. You can buy lots of different sizes as well, but most of us that feed have a lot of feeders and feed all year round usually try and get some big bags because it's less expensive. I've heard on Facebook that Costco has bird seed as well, and there's a fair selection, and that they have really good sales. And then there's lots of other places where you can get seed. Some of it's just small bags, which would cost you a fortune over time. And there's maybe not as much selection. So it seems like in our area that Miner Brothers are the place to go. But certainly if you think the seed you're getting from any other place is good, go for it. Oops. Okay, well, I've talked a bit about predators and critters that want to eat your seed for your birds, and squirrels and raccoons seem to be the number two. See, I spelled raccoon wrong there. Sorry. Seem to be two of the most difficult ones to deal with. You could get some cheap seed and feed them on the ground separately. Um, you need to keep your feeders at least 6 feet away from anything they can launch off of. A branch from a tree, your roof, they will spend hours and hours trying to learn how to get onto the feeder. And it's a constant battle. I think it took Tim about 3 years to figure out where to put the feeders so the birds wouldn't, so the squirrels wouldn't be able to launch themselves onto these feeders. Um, and another really, really important thing is the baffles. You can see about a foot or two below the actual feeder. So these are structures that the squirrels cannot climb up onto. They're too slippery. Other people grease the poles. But you can also get creative. So this person actually put a slinky up on the pole. So this poor squirrel would get up the pole and then climb onto the slinky and then go for a little ride. He actually, in the end, learned to ride it up and then jump onto the feeder. No, he didn't. He learned to not get on the slinky and jump from the pole to the feeder. So he did learn after a time that he could get to that feeder. And it doesn't have to be expensive. Birds don't care what the feeder looks like. And you can see from our feeder, it's not beautiful. You don't want to paint the feeders. Paint can be poisonous to the birds, same as if you put up any houses for them. The paint is not a good idea. They like rustic. Yeah, this feeder, Dawn took a picture of this feeder, and it's basically just uh, um, one of those pot holders, that you put under plants in a pot, and stuck a structure on top to hold the seed. And you can see the person on the right was very creative. So Orioles love fruit, so they just took an old rake and put some oranges on it, which is perfect for the birds. If you've got children and you want to do a project with them, you can probably take a plastic bottle and put a hole in it and someplace for the bird to perch and put some seed in it. So you can be very creative with your feeders. But if you want to go all out, you can do what I call the combination feeders. So you have a structure that you can hang up several feeders from, and this is um, from the Goodrich's yard, and you can see that there's a lot of capability to add on if they wanted to. The seed is well protected with some domes. You've got a variety of feeders. On the left, you've got a peanut feeder. You've got on the right a suet feeder. At the back with the yellow on it is a Niger feeder, and then a mixed seed feeder at the top there. So really great setup that will attract a lot of different kinds of birds. And they get some great birds in their yard. Here's one of my favorite setups. This is Dawn, and you can see she's used a lot of natural habitat, which probably makes the birds feel just a bit more comfortable when they come to her feeder. And it's also right beside her window. So I forgot to mention the most important thing about feeding birds, and that's to have it by a window where you can watch the birds and enjoy them, especially during the last couple of days when it's been so cold, and they will be at the feeder because they need the energy. Sometimes birds forget to migrate, and that's when you can spend a lot of money on them too. So this was a setup for a calliope hummingbird, which is normally out west, and ended up in a feeder 2 winters ago in Godrich, Ontario, if you can imagine, in the middle of winter. I believe this was December. And oh my gosh. So what she did, she went out and got 2 heaters. So you can see the heat lamps. There's one above the feeders, and there's one in a structure that she had built for the bird to roost in at night. Um, when it got dark, she would take in the feeders, and then she would get up before dawn and make up a new batch of nectar, of sugar and water, and heat it up for the bird. And this went on for about a month. And I would say at least 200 people went to see this bird because it was the first record for Ontario. And we were so grateful to her for all the effort she went into, helping this bird try and survive. And in fact, it survived until there was a bit of a warm spell. And so we all feel optimistic that the bird actually was able to fly south. So, which is wonderful. But she put a lot of expense and trouble into this. And so the deal was, and because we were tromping in her backyard too, was that we all made a minimum donation of at least $3. And that was to go the money she'd spent on the heaters and everything, plus any damage we did to her yard. So hopefully it was win-win for the bird, for the homeowner, and the birders. And if you get a good bird, just know this might happen. You might have 200 new friends, unless you don't tell anybody, but you really should tell me. Okay. So you've got your feeder set up and it's so exciting, and you're anticipating seeing lots of birds and they're not there. Well, the reality is birds like having the feeders. It helps them survive certainly a cold snap like we've had, but most of them aren't reliant on feeders at all. They prefer native food. And they rely on more than one source. So you know that you only see your birds occasionally through the day. You don't see them out there during all the daylight hours. It's because they can't depend on one source. In fact, it would be fine if you, in the good old days when you could travel in the winter and go south, if you didn't feed the birds for a week or two, they'd still come back because they'll remember that you had a good feeder. But most of their energy, even if they're coming to a feeder, is from native food, from wild food, which is another reason for why we have to protect all our natural areas. And also, if you've got a predator that's found the feeder, they've actually, sharp-shinned and Cooper's hawks have learned to incorporate feeders into their feeding strategy because they know that there's going to be lots of birds there. So, so if you're not getting the birds, and I think probably a lot of us had that experience even into November because it was quite mild, but the reality is this is when you're actually saving birds. And from between 10 and 30% of birds are actually saved during cold snaps like this, because you have a feeder. So, and in particular, what I call the climate change birds, which I'll mention soon. So this is a critical time when you need to be out there when it's really cold, filling up those feeders, because it does make a difference. And the birds really need any help they can get because they are all mostly in decline. So you could, another strategy for feeding the birds is to grow your own. And this is a lovely, lovely field, which we all wish we had, of black oil sunflowers. But of course, that's not always practical, but you could have a few in your yard. And in fact, if you're going to plant anything in your yard, you should plant native species, because the plants that you find at nurseries in general are what we call exotic. They have been bred to look beautiful, and they do, but they don't have any nutrition for birds or for pollinators. So it's really important, if you're going to plant anything, if you plant native species. If you feed birds, it's also important to have, they really need the shelter as well, because they've got to get through a long, cold night. And that's why you often see them coming to your feeder later in the afternoon, because they've got to store up some fat. to help them get through the night. They will fluff up their feathers. They'll sometimes roost together, anything to get through these cold nights. So evergreens that kind of are insulating are great. Um, we've even had Carolina wrens and at once an eastern phoebe that stayed into the winter. You go into our garage because there might be the odd spider or insect that they can eat. Even a basket, or in particular, any place where they can get under like a porch and be close to the house where they can get some heat will help them survive in the winter. So the big question, and it's a big debate, is do feeders help or hurt birds? I mean, is it taking them away from what they would do naturally, or do they actually help? And the consensus is yes, they do help. They don't help as many birds as we think because there's a lot of wild food and they're able to survive naturally most times. But in these serious long cold snaps, they actually really do help the birds. In particular, what I call the climate change birds. So these are birds that weren't here maybe 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, because they preferred a warmer climate. But as our climate, and it seems funny mentioning it today, but as our climate warms up, they've been moving north. They're called range extensions. In fact, northern cardinal, it first nested in 1901 in Point Pelee. They weren't known in Canada, um, at least in Ontario, until the early 1900s. And even if you look at 1930 and 1940 on eBird, there's hardly any cardinals there. So the eBird is a database where birders record their sightings, and of course, records from that far back are really only people that have notes or that we can find information about birds. So there aren't a lot of records anyways, but there are very few cardinals. And so it's remarkable that they are actually here and very happily here. So last year, for instance, I think they had a really good breeding season, and we've had like a dozen cardinals at our feeder during in one day, and I know somebody else is reporting to me at least that many as well. So they're very happy to be here. They survive quite nicely, but they're probably a bird that definitely benefited from feeders, especially in the winter. And they're not the only climate change bird. There's lots more. Carolina wrens in particular, this is a winter where they might not survive. And all they need to survive is one peanut a day. That gives them enough um, protein and fat to survive for the winter. So it doesn't take much, but they've really got to get that food. And so they are probably more dependent on feeders than other species. And the same for tufted titmouse, red-bellied woodpecker, and northern mockingbird. These are birds that wouldn't have been here, like I say, 50 or 60 or more years ago. But as the climate changes, they're extending their range up north, but they certainly in these kind of harsh winters benefit from feeders. Okay, almost done there, folks. So I just want to say that I am the regional coordinator in Niagara for the Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, which started in January. It's a 5-year project. If you have a property and would like me or somebody else to come in and have a look at which birds are nesting on it so we can submit those records to the atlas, please let me know. Or if you have records of breeding birds, let me know as well, and I can make sure that they get into the atlas. If you want to participate in this project, go to birdsontario.org and register. So why do we want to feed birds? There is so much evidence in the scholarly literature now that tells us that birds and nature make us happy. So again, we get back to that strong connection we have with nature that we might not even realize we have until you start spending some time out there and realizing. And that's been one of the good things about COVID, is that so many people have had the opportunity lately to have time to do that. And in fact, the number of people recording their sightings on eBird has increased 30%. So the number of birders has increased 30%. And I'm sure there's lots of other people that feed birds that have increased that much as well. So so it's a strategy that is helping us get through these challenging times and bring us some happiness, which is wonderful for the birds and for the people that enjoy them. And one last bit about the festival that's coming up this weekend. I'm so excited about it. We've worked really, really, really hard on this, and it's going to promote birds and conservation along the Niagara River. There's going to be some excellent presentations. I've been able to get a few good speakers, and overall, there's a lot of good speakers. The website is birdsontheniagara.org. Just scroll down a bit and look for the schedule and see what time. It starts about 6 on Friday and it goes till Sunday evening. And I can guarantee you'll find something in there that you'll enjoy watching. And that is the end of my presentation.